Hi, I am Eleni Manis. I'm the research director at S.T.O.P, the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project. And I'm glad to welcome you to the power and peril of geolocation data. Our panel is hosted by S.T.O.P, the New York State Assembly, and Gizmodo. And we're here to talk about geolocation data, the location data generated by your cell phones and other mobile devices. To get started, I want to briefly introduce our panelists. New York Assembly member Dan Quart represents the 73rd District, covering the Upper East Side and parts of Midtown East in New York City. He's been a longtime advocate for criminal justice reform, including cash bail and fair compensation for falsely convicted people. He's also an advocate for working families, and he secured significant funding for the construction of the Second Avenue subway. Dan is a candidate for Manhattan District Attorney.
Good afternoon.
Shoshana I'm so glad that you're here. Shoshana Wodinsky is a staff reporter at Gizmodo. She covers consumer privacy and tech policy. And in her own words, which I liked a lot, Shoshana focuses on how major companies earn their big bucks through online advertising. In particular, she investigates how ad tech tools enable redlining and discrimination in the digital age. Previously, she wrote for Adweek.
I'm also an Upper East Side resident, so thanks, Dan.
Albert Fox-Cahn, my colleague, is the founder and executive director of S.T.O.P, the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project. He's also a fellow at the Engelberg Center on Innovation Law and Policy at NYU's Law School. Albert's absolutely devoted to resisting the threat that surveillance tools pose to civil rights and to a free society. And he's made the case against surveillance on news outlets ranging from CNN to Fox News and from the New York Times to the New York Daily News. In recent years, he's grown S.T.O.P into an organization of over 20 staffers and committed volunteers, and I'm proud to be one. Welcome, everyone. Let's get started. So tell me, what is geolocation data?
I am happy to defer to Shoshana on this because I feel like she'll be able to get much more into the details to start us off.
As far as I know, it's literally what it sounds like. It's just your longitudinal and latitudinal. It's basically your coordinates of where you are, and that's usually given off by certain signals that your phone gives off, for better or worse. It can be used for all sorts of things. It can be used by cops to track people. It can also be used for targeted marketing. It's very, It's very multifunctional.
And I would just add that, not all geo data is the same. Some geolocation information can be very precise. Some of it can be, down to a matter of feet. With some of the new beacons, it can be supposedly within a matter of inches of where you're standing, and sometimes it could be within a couple miles of where you are with some of the cell site location data. So it's really any time where you're trying to correlate where someone was at a specific time with any degree of specificity.
Right. Well, actually, I just wanted to note there, a lot of what we think about as location data is actually not very precise at all. It's usually within it's usually within some kind of radius that can be as far as half a mile is what I've seen. So when you hear about oh no, companies are tracking me every day using my cell phone, it's usually not as precise as you think. Granted, there are some companies that do, like Albert said, with a very kind of fine, they kind of do this thing with kind of a fine grained comb, but for the most part, it's not as precise as they like to kind of portray. Sorry to interrupt.
No, I think that's so important because anyone who has tried to use Google Maps in the city or done map your run and you see what path it shows you afterwards, it's this really squiggly thing where it's wait, I didn't cross over to the street and then back, and because all of these different things can throw off your perceived location. GPS is only accurate within 22 to 42 feet usually, and so it really varies depending on the technology, where that technology is being deployed, and so many other factors.
This raises two related questions. The first is, who collects geolocation data? You mentioned a fitness app. And then tell me more about how the reliability of the data, its specificity with respect to what my coordinates are, varies with who's collecting the data.
That's certainly a major concern, who is collecting the data, and that's sort of my introduction to why I got involved in this issue, wrote legislation about it, because I was deeply concerned about the law enforcement aspect of the collection of this data. And if you look at it systemically, both by the NYPD and district attorney's offices, the gathering of technology is used in a comprehensive way, well beyond geofencing data. But today, I know we're focusing on geofencing data and getting people's cell phone data. But this was used specifically to Manhattanites, no doubt my constituents, in a specific instance, where the normal and regular ways in which law enforcement should solve crime were either not applied or not applied to their satisfaction. So they relied on this technique. And that's how I became concerned with it and wrote legislation that would stop this practice. But to the answer to your first question, it's definitely what concerns me most is law enforcement usage of this. Although the usage of this data for commercial means and for profit is in some ways equally concerning as well.
Well, sorry.
Please.
Well, actually, those two ideas are kind of correlated. So in a lot of cases, this data is at first collected for commercial means, but then law enforcement can kind of... I'm sorry, Mike, I have two cats and one of them is making noise in the background. But then government officials can technically just buy that data for themselves because it is a commercial entity and it's not technically being used for law enforcement. It's being used for quote unquote advertising purposes. But you've had in the past, there was this really kind of blockbuster story for the Wall Street Journal, I believe about a year ago, where you had this one ad agency, well, not an ad agency, but an ad tech company that was actively working with, I think it was ICE, to offer data specifically of people at the border. And this was their location data that was being collected by apps on their phone. So the line between what is used for government means and what's used for marketing purposes is getting increasingly fuzzy. And the fact that there's no kind of clear legislation surrounding that, at least on the federal level, is kind of concerning.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I completely agree. But I think just stepping back and looking at how this data is collected initially, it's every part of the internet ecosystem we're a part of is trying to constantly capture our location, right? So oftentimes the hardware itself is trying to capture location. Our internet service providers are trying to capture the location. If we're using Wi-Fi, if we're using all sorts of ways to access the internet, that's capturing our location. The apps on our phone, the websites we're visiting, nearly every touch point we have with the digital world is trying to capture our information because it's a super lucrative way to get money from advertisers. And so there's this whole profit motive built in to create this constant perpetual location tracking network, which then once it's set up for people to, sell us, whatever they're trying to sell us, that same repository of information can be used and abused by ICE, by the NYPD, and by any other government agency, even the IRS. So it seems like, at least in the first instance, a lot of that data is being collected just by people who view it as a way to make a buck.
Can you tell me a little bit more about why location data would be so valuable to advertisers?
I'm going to do this with the help of Cahn because he's being a little bit loud. So the thing about location data is that it's not just location. You can infer a lot about a person based on where they are. So for example, I have a local gym that before the pandemic, I would be walking into all the time. And every time I go into that gym, they have their own Wi-Fi network that I connect to. So now that gym has a pretty accurate, timestamp of when I'm going to the gym and when I'm connecting to their Wi-Fi, and they can say, okay, this is a person that goes to the gym in the mornings. And that's like a specific type of consumer that would probably buy, I don't know, protein shakes, for example. And then you kind of think about, okay, who's the type of person that goes I'm trying to think of other kind of places that people walk to. For example, if somebody goes to bookstores a lot, that's another type of consumer. If somebody goes to pet stores a lot, that's another type. So all of these you're leaving kind of a fingerprint of what kind of consumer you are based on where you are. And for a lot of marketers, that's a more accurate way to kind of profile people than, only the sites that they visit. And often, those are these kind of like digital means are becoming a lot more policed and a lot more heavily regulated than things like location data. So that's often kind of a MO that they're starting to adopt more and more.
And Shoshana, correct me if I'm wrong, but from some of the research I've seen, like, it's not just information that's helpful for advertising those protein shakes or advertising someone a coffee drink right by as they're passing the Starbucks, but oftentimes it's the most valuable type of data to when you're serving ads. That because you're at the moment of persuasion and you're at the moment where people are getting ready to make a purchase or are most susceptible to it. And so obviously it's hard to generalize with any ad pricing, but it seems like compared to a lot of the data out there, advertising tied to real-time location information gets a lot pricier and seems to be a bigger focus.
I can't confirm pricing because, like you said, a lot of the stuff is so freaking opaque. But I do know a lot of people do put a lot of value. Like, for example, I have a Dwayne Reed that's down the street from me, and I know that they're like tracking my location. Like, a lot of big box retailers often have, like you said, like beacons that are kind of like placed around the store for that exact reason, because they want to get people at the time of purchase and they want to know like what aisles people are walking past. So people will be like, oh, this person's in the market for toothpaste. We're going to like market a ton of toothpaste at this specific person. And they know that they can do that. And they know that this person is probably going to buy it based on where they were. So like you said, yeah, I don't know if it's the most valuable, but I do know it is very valuable, which is why there's so many sites and apps and all that stuff that try to collect it.
I get it now. It's creepy. And I also understand why it would be so commercially valuable. As Dan has suggested, there's also value in this information to the police. And we're going to be talking very soon about geofence warrants, which you referred to. But let's establish a baseline first. Have the police accessed geolocation data in the past using traditional warrants? What did that process look like?
So basically, our Constitution is not very good at differentiating different types of data that you're capturing through a warrant because, well, it was written, back in the 1700s by people who had never even considered the possibility of an internet. So when you look at the standard, basically, there are two types of ways of getting information, either through a subpoena, which is a very low bar, or a warrant, which is a kind of middle of the road bar that requires probable cause from an officer to get a court order to compel the data to be handed over. And if you look at, the information from Google and a lot of the larger tech firms, they get these requests, they get court orders tens of thousands of times a year. And so, for example, a traditional a version of a geolocation warrant might be saying, okay, I know Shoshana is up to a lot of no good with her cat. I know she is a very, I have probable cause that she and the cat are doing something criminal.
You're not wrong. He's criminally adorable.
Oh.
Anyway.
Thankfully not yet illegal in New York, but we go and we go to the court and we say we want an order to Google and to Shoshana's ISP and to the following app she uses for all the information they have about Shoshana. And so depending on her account settings, that might give us like a pretty detailed minute by minute description of where she's been over recent months, over years. And one of the most common versions of this is cell site location information, where it includes the information from every time we make a call, receive a call, or even have a data packet that's sent or received from our cell phone, and gives the cell companies a nearly indefinite map of our location history.
So to summarize one key bit, these traditional warrants are served on individuals, right? A single individual. Now, how about geofence warrants? What are they? How do they work? And how do they differ from traditional warrants?
Well, that is the essence of it. The Fourth Amendment requires a particularized search. And although no court has said this specifically yet, and the Supreme Court hasn't weighed in yet, geofence warrants are anything but a particularized search. They are the search, as Shoshana said, of longitude and latitude, and looking at specific areas and trying to gather individuals who were in that area through their cell phone service. I have my own views that there's there's no way to reconcile the Fourth Amendment with this practice. And I think Albert can talk about the courts that have come close to saying things of that nature. But to me, it is antithetical to the whole practice of what the Fourth Amendment search should be, a particularized probable cause based upon a particularized theory of criminal wrongdoing, rather than a general essence of we know there was criminal conduct or we believe there was criminal conduct in a certain area at a certain time. We don't have probable cause to actually identify or arrest an individual. So we will use this other tool, which is non-specific, overbroad, to try and get data on anyone and everyone who was in that area, to the hopes of then bringing in that data, reviewing it, and narrowing it down to identify the individual government believes is the person they should seek to deprive liberty from. It works in complete reversal to the whole lineage of constitutional process on people's individual rights and what the Fourth Amendment is there for, which is to protect individuals against non-particularized searches. But unfortunately, courts have said maybe language somewhat to that effect, but not. This is an area where the federal courts and the state courts, I don't think, have caught up to what I think many of us see as a plain abridgment of people's Fourth Amendment rights.
Yeah, and I think it's really, when you think about the Fourth Amendment implications, I think it's so important to look back. I know I'm the person who keeps harping on the 18th century here, but like at the founding of this country, we had a lot of fear of general warrants. This idea that, the British officers at the time had a piece of paper that was stamped that basically gave them the right to seize anyone at any time, to go into any place to conduct a search, that basically was a free pass to violate anyone's right to privacy whenever they wanted. And, that's the reason we have the Fourth Amendment, to stop that from happening again. But geofence warrants are so broad that we end up with the digital equivalent of a general warrant. The digital equivalent of something that lets, the police search nearly anyone at nearly any time for nearly any reason.
For audience members who have never heard of a geofence warrant, can someone give us an easy example of how one works?
Imagine a tuna net, like on like a fishing boat. No, I'm kidding. It's basically, Albert, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, because this isn't really my expertise, but isn't it like when you just establish I want to know every kind of cell phone ID that tripped into this particular radius based on their cell phone location data. Is that right?
Yeah, so it's really crude. So basically what officers do is, there was a case down in Virginia that's being challenged in the federal courts. And what happened there was a bank robbery. And they didn't know who had committed the bank robbery. So they decided to go on a fishing expedition with Shoshana's imaginary tuna net. And what they did was they went to the bank and then they drew a circle around the bank and said, I want to know everyone who was within that, I think it was like half a mile radius of the bank. And like when you say it that way, it's like, okay, I can kind of understand that. The problem was it was such a big circle, it overlapped with an entire nearby church. So anyone who was in that church was within the scope of that geofence. And it's really, there's no scientific basis for saying this is how big the circle should be. This is how long you should have it for. And it's so easy to have a false positive where someone gets wrongly accused of a crime because they are within this arbitrarily drawn circle at the time it happened.
Or if you're like riding a bike through that circle, there's nothing to stop you from accidentally ending up in kind of that bucket of suspects. And you would have no idea. You just happened to be riding your bike that day.
Completely. I think just as a matter of statistics, one thing that people know is that the larger a group you're creating, the larger the sample set, the higher the probability that you'll find someone who looks like they're fitting the pattern that you're looking for. And so, even if no one actually is responsible in that geofence sample, it's so easy if you draw a huge circle to find someone who, they were they were persistently circling the scene of the crime. They must be the suspect. When, in this one case from Florida that Shoshana is referencing, it was just someone who did long distance biking and would just cycle around the neighborhood, and that was their only crime.
Okay, so whereas a traditional warrant we might ask, where was John Brown on Friday? A geofence warrant might ask, who was in or near Washington Square Park on Friday? And you just get everybody with your 2 to know. Thanks. I want to remind audience members that you can put questions in the Q&A box. I'm not monitoring the chat right now, but we'll be looking at the Q&A for later on when we ask questions from the audience. To get back to one of Dan's concerns, I want to know, have geofence warrants been used in New York City? What kind of evidence do we have around the use of geofence warrants here at home?
Well, I know Dan can speak to this case because it happened in his district, but one case, Dan, I don't know if you can hear us, but did you want to tell us about what happened with the club?
Yeah, my apologies. I'm having my own Wi-Fi problems today, and but thank you, Albert. And this is the case. Several years ago, a local political club, the Metropolitan Republican Club, in their infinite wisdom, decided to have the Proud Boys, who were less well known then, although well known to many of us, well known now, to their club for the second time in 6 or 8 months. And that led to essentially a riot on the street on the east side of Manhattan, in the East 80s on Lexington Avenue. There was interaction between protesters and members of the Proud Boys who engaged in physical violence based upon eyewitness accounts of many different people. For reasons that I won't get into now, the local precinct that was aware of it didn't make many arrests or any arrests of any of the Proud Boys, instead of mostly of the protesters. There was some public outcry since the Proud Boys are on the Southern Poverty Law Center list as a hate group. So no arrests were made. So law enforcement, both the NYPD and the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, was under pressure to make arrests, having failed to do so at the time of the actual incident for deployment issues and all other problems. I know they did some investigation in terms of going to the nearby buildings and trying to see if there was any footage identifying individuals. That turned out not to be very helpful. They did some normal police work of investigation and trying to find eyewitnesses who can identify individuals. And that did not prove very successful. So Mr. Vance served a geofence search warrant to try and gather all sorts of information about people who were in that vicinity at a certain time of the evening on that night, using longitude and latitude lines. And he got all sorts of data, which to this day, I still don't know where that data is, what happened to that data, who maintained it or who didn't maintain it, and no further arrests, as far as I know, were made based upon that data, which I think is instructive as to those who say, well, this is a necessary tool for law enforcement to make arrests. As far as I know, no additional arrests were made based upon Vance's geofence warrant in this respect. And when I learned about this and then talked to Albert, I realized beyond this being a practice that was not something was consistent with my values and what I believe to be true, that hundreds probably of my own constituents who are in that neighborhood, or any New Yorker who might have been in an Uber or a taxi cab driving through that neighborhood at that time, probably had their Fourth Amendment rights violated. And they may not have known about it. And some people who I've talked to about this are indifferent to it, but that doesn't matter. They're allowing their rights to be violated is not something I'm okay with, and nor should anyone else. And many people who I've told about the practice, my constituents, were not okay with this and wanted to know if the government had taken their data. So ultimately, that practice didn't prove to be very successful in leading to any more additional arrests for the failure of deployments by the local precinct and all sorts of other things. So then Albert and I got to work on drafting legislation that does two things: make sure that it's understandable that this is not an acceptable practice in New York State court. And the second part, which I think is important, which is less talked about, is that this type of evidence is inadmissible in a courtroom in New York State, because There are all sorts of tricks ambitious government entities can play with the federal partners, where one entity secures it and then another entity uses it in a courtroom. And to me, that does not fix the initial abridgment of somebody's constitutional rights. If New York State law enforcement secures it, but knowing that they can't use it in the state courtroom, that they provide it to a federal law enforcement agency in which to prosecute. So my legislation gets at both ends of that matter to ensure that this, not only are we saying as a state this practice is antithetical to the Fourth Amendment and is outlawed, but secondly, it can't be used by federal partners if secured by a state entity or vice versa.
And can I just say one thing that is really stunning to me about this case in hindsight is how closely it maps onto some of the dynamics we saw with the Capitol insurrection, that we had police failing to take the threat of right-wing extremism seriously, that there was violence, that they didn't actually arrest the right-wing extremists at the time it happened, and then they used that failure by the police to justify a further expansion of surveillance technology. And in this case, didn't target it at the Proud Boys, but targeted at the Antifa protesters who had been targeted by the Proud Boys. And we're actually trying to identify the victims and witnesses. And so it's just this maddening thing where it's just propagating so much of the inequity and discrimination that is central to police surveillance.
And certainly, I just one further point, and it's always the law of unintended consequences, that it's not, you always hear law enforcement, it's not our intent, we would never use it this way. But I'll give a hypothetical where with this practice could be extended to actually bridge two constitutional rights at the same time, both the Fourth Amendment and the First Amendment. Obviously, there were mass protests after George Floyd and many protests in New York and Manhattan and Brooklyn. But you could imagine this practice being used against protesters to identify who was there at a certain point where something happened, quelling not only somebody's First Amendment right, but continuing to abridge their Fourth Amendment right. So that's also my concern, that this could be a tool against people legally using their First Amendment rights to protest. We all saw how the NYPD responded, in my view, over-responded. Certainly the Human Rights Watch identified that in the Bronx. So this tool, not only in situations that Albert rightfully, because we've seen it now twice with right-wing extremists, but also could be used in other ways. And I just use one example against protesters, theoretically. Now, I haven't seen it used that way, but there's nothing stopping law enforcement from doing so. And that's why I think this is a dangerous practice that simply can't be used, that the balance of scales of the potential harm done vastly outweighs whatever theoretical good this sort of search warrant could accomplish.
Can I just say something really quick? Sorry.
Of course.
I think, I mean, Albert, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but hasn't it, I think it has been used against protesters. Actually, I'm on my computer right now. Let me check.
Yeah, so there have been a couple times when it appears to have been used by protesters. We don't know for sure that the NYPD has used it that way, but we definitely suspect it has.
Right. I think the Minneapolis police, I think that was a pretty,
So in the aftermath of George Floyd's killing, we learned that there were at least one geofence warrant, possibly others, that were used to target those taking part in the uprising. And it, given the way that we've seen like both federal, state, and also local resources being used to target those protests, I would be shocked if we didn't have some geofence warrants from this summer in New York.
Something I just wanted to say is that, in a lot of cases, when we talk about geofence warrants, we talk about geofence warrants being served to Google because that is a major data provider. But what a lot of people forget is that there's hundreds, if not, definitely like hundreds of other smaller data providers working in the US that have their own buckets of location data that could also work with law enforcement and don't have the public spotlight that Google, a publicly traded company, has. And right now, there's nothing stopping police if they sense that the heat is on them for doing business with Google. There's really nothing stopping them from using a smaller operator, at least right now.
And I should say, in the Proud Boy case, it actually came out in the court transcript that they hadn't just served a geofence warrant on Google. They had served it in that case on Uber, on Lyft, on Venmo, on I think one or two others. And there may have been more, but you're right. Like any company that's collecting this information is creating a giant target for any police department that gets ambitious.
Right. And because it's so profitable, a lot of companies want to collect it by any means necessary. So you have this kind of vicious cycle where companies are being told to collect this data in order to turn a profit, and then police kind of see that and they're like, hey, I see another use for this stuff.
Let me sum up just a little bit of what I'm hearing, and we'll address it to Dan's constituents who aren't so worried about geofence warrants. And what I'm hearing is that if we care about democratic norms, about our democratic society, we should be hesitant to normalize indiscriminate searches, right? If we care about the Fourth Amendment, and we should care about suppressing freedom of speech, which is what you get if people can't protest without fearing that they're being tracked.
I mean, I would go further, and sorry, Dan.
No, go ahead, please, Albert. Okay.
When we talk about police surveillance, it's not just an invasion of privacy. It's not just collecting data. It's often the gateway to police stops, to police interactions. It is often the first step towards a SWAT team at someone's door or a knee to someone's neck. And that oftentimes you can't look at the dangers of police surveillance without looking at the dangers of police violence, especially to Black New Yorkers, but to any New Yorker who is forced into an interaction with law enforcement because one of these surveillance tools.
And part of the what's so frustrating here is it's always law enforcement reacting to initial failure, to use the normal methods of investigation to address something. And the Proud Boys incident is a good example, because this was the second time that this group was at this political club in a 1-year time period, that the local precinct was fully aware. I think they had 40 plus officers in and around the area. But for some reason, there was never, at least to my satisfaction, a sufficient after-action plan addressed by the NYPD, why no actual arrests were made. But and this seems to be a habitual area of repeated failures by law enforcement, certainly with respect to right-wing extremist groups. And you saw it right out here on the streets of my district. So then the back end is when the public outcry comes, and we all come together as a community, both faith-based leaders and elected officials and community leaders, and we say, this is outrageous. Why did this happen? Unfortunately, law enforcement, instead of addressing its initial failures, then goes to these questionable techniques, and which ultimately, as Albert said more artfully than I, really is not only an abridgment of constitutional rights, but is a gateway to interactions that become more prevalent, more violent, more aggressive, and can lead to tragedy. So you can't, it's bad enough looking at these practices in a vacuum, but they are also can be looked at objectively as a bridge to more aggressive police tactics. If the initial constitutional abridgment wasn't bad enough.
Let me ask a related question. So police can also purchase location data instead of serving a warrant for it. Is that happening here in New York City? And what safeguards are there to prevent the police from purchasing location data, if any?
I don't know if it's happening in New York City, but I know I can purchase location data right now. There's marketplaces online. There's specifically like data kind of warehouses that you can buy this sort of stuff off of. And it's expensive. A lot of sort of marketing data is, but it's not hard to get if you know how the industry works and where to look. And
I'm sorry, nothing. No, go ahead, Shoshana. My apologies.
No, it's okay. I was just going to say, even if I doubt a federal official would know that stuff off the top of their head, but they definitely know people who do.
And I think one of the problems, if you look at it from a governance model, is the oversight of the NYPD. People think they're, at least in the governmental level, is minimal. To the extent you as the voter or the individual have faith in the NYPD to self-monitor, I don't. But the only body that really looks at NYPD practices is the city council. with their oversight hearings. Interestingly enough, it was Commissioner Shea who, for a long period of time before he was commissioner, was the one who would go before the council and talk about their quote unquote gang database collection and all their different different spreadsheets and software in which they accumulated data on people. So is this practice going on today? Impossible to know. But I'm not sure, and well, actually, I'm pretty convinced that the governmental oversight is not there to ferret it out and bring it to the public's attention. And you have a police commissioner now who is really in charge of a lot of these, I would argue, spying techniques and creating lists and database, mostly of young men of color throughout Manhattan. So it is a worrisome question. I don't know the answer to it, but I'm not confident the governmental response is there to actually identify it and stop it.
And I want to give a shout out to our colleagues in the Gangs Coalition who have been working to dismantle that database, both the NYPD database and the one in the DA's offices. But I mean, part of why the data purchasing is so dangerous is when you go to a judge and ask for a geofence warrant, they're getting approved more than I would want, but there's some amazing decisions that are pushing back. So there's that case I mentioned from Virginia where it's on appeal, but there's also this great magistrate judge in Illinois, Gabe Fuentes, who wrote an opinion denying a geofence warrant. But when you go to buy this data, it's like the Fourth Amendment doesn't exist. It's like there's no protection whatsoever. And this is, a somewhat obscure doctrine called the third party doctrine, where for years the courts essentially said, if you're getting this information not from the person who you're investigating, but from a commercial entity that they do business with, like the bank records or the telephone records, the Fourth Amendment doesn't exist and you don't need to go through the usual warrant process. And so that's kind of invasive when you're talking about checks, but when you're talking about getting all of my geolocation data, that's so much worse. And that's the dynamic we've had for all of this data, where it's been a complete free-for-all. And so part of why city council oversight matters so much more is because you don't even have that pretext of judges holding the police accountable for whose data they're purchasing, how much of it, and how they're sharing it.
Right, like for example, I just went online to, like, for example, AWS, like Amazon controls a massive data warehouse called the AWS Marketplace, and I just went online just to double check. And I can tell you, like, you can buy a location database of everybody that's like walked into Targets in Manhattan for about, how much is it? For about $10,000 for a month's worth of data. Like, that's a lot of money, but it's not a lot of money for a federal entity. And also, like, when you start thinking about it, it doesn't just have to be Targets. It could be homeless shelters. It could be hospitals. It can be literally, because there's location brokers, I'll call them brokers, that work with literally any entity you can think of. And when you,
sorry. I just wanted to add, and one location in particular we have to be careful about is mosques, right? Because the NYPD systematically tried to monitor every mosque in New York City for more than a decade through undercover officers spending millions of dollars. It was a complete waste of money. It was discriminatory. But now they can just buy that data, right? They can just go and buy the data for everyone going to a mosque with a cell phone.
It's kind of funny because I've never been pitched on mosque location data, but I can tell you there's hundreds of churches across the US that have their locations monitored. Because for some reason that's really profitable. So yeah, like, this doesn't stop at retail locations. It does extend to like houses of worship. And people like me get pitched on this stuff all the time because people don't see it as a problem. They see it as something profitable.
Can't touch it. I'm looking like an idiot.
Let me ask then, given these two ways that location data can leak to the police, by geofence warrants, by sale, what steps can companies take to prevent these abuses? I
mean, they can not keep the data, right? So if you don't keep the data, you can get all the geofence warrants that police want, but you'll just tell them to go away. So for example, like we talk about Google getting a lot of these, and it seems that they get hundreds and hundreds of them every year, but Apple doesn't get many because when they get them, they simply say, sorry, you're out of luck. We don't actually keep our location data in a way where it's responsive to this. And with Google, there's one specific database called Sensor Vault, where it's responsible for the vast majority of these. And so with Google, if they wanted to get rid of Geofence Warrants to Google, they could just eliminate censorable.
We'll talk more about Google soon.
Done a great job.
Dan or Shoshana, did you want to weigh in?
Dan, you can go.
No, that you guys covered it very well. Nothing to add.
Oh, okay. Well, something I just wanted to add to that then. Sorry, Dan. It's funny that you mentioned Apple, because Apple recently it's in the middle of issuing this major hardware update that's going to make it a lot harder for a lot of these companies to request, the precise sort of geolocation that they've been getting until now. The iOS 14 update, yada, yada, it caused a lot of controversy because suddenly apps have to ask permission to request specific data, including location. So you have a lot of companies looking for other ways to get geolocation data. And suddenly they're saying, okay, if we have a Wi-Fi network that we can force somebody to log into, that's another way we can get it without, having to finagle the sort of permission from Apple. So you have companies right now actively looking for ways around these sort of hardware barriers that are closing up around them. And we also see them trying to get around legislative barriers too, and with GDPR over in the UK and CCPA here in the US.
Let me ask another question then. So we've heard about what companies can do to prevent these abuses. What can I do? What steps can an individual take to prevent their geolocation data from either being collected or being abused?
I'll give you my phone.
So there are a lot of steps you can take to reduce the way location data is tracked in your own account. For example, there are guides you can on how you can limit, turn off the location history in your Google account, and suddenly they can't actually comply with a geofence warrant. Those sorts of ways of disabling data collection are very helpful. And one thing I would highlight is the security education manual put out by EFF. So the Security Education Companion does a great job of explaining steps you can take to sort of disable the way these systems track you. But one of the things that's really frustrating is that some of these platforms keep making claims that are just turn out to be blatantly false about what control you do have. And one need only look at the number of Facebook settlements to know that simply checking the right checkboxes isn't always going to be enough.
I'll just add in here that I wrote basically a 3,500 word feature on how to keep your phone safe at protests, and that did not barely begin to scratch the surface. I'm sure I can share a link to that somewhere, but it's very complicated. And the best thing I can probably tell people, besides throwing your phone and computer out the window, is just carry a burner everywhere. If you really want to be get a flip phone, get one for $50. Pay in cash, just operate like you're on the run.
I mean, it's just such a terrible thing that we have to tell people to do who really want to exercise their First Amendment right. And that they have to take all these measures to protect themselves and protect their data, both against illegal Fourth Amendment searches from my perspective, but the First Amendment, it's the first one. It's the right to speak freely and protest. And I think, unfortunately, people will have to think twice about their cell phones, and they use it to identify often officer misconduct at these events. But the idea that act could then lead to law enforcement not only securing your identification and things of that nature, but a violation of your constitutional rights, it is quite chilling.
Dan, you're taking steps to help us not have to take these steps. You're a sponsor of New York State Assembly Bill 84. Can you tell us a bit about it? Yeah. And then Shoshana and Albert, will you give us your takes on the bill?
With State Senator Zellner Myrie from Brooklyn, who I'm sure would be here. He's recovering from COVID. So if he's watching, I hope he's feeling better and on the road to recovery. We're working together on this legislation that would simply outlaw this practice. And I think working with Albert, the idea was, in my view, and certainly I don't want to speak for Albert, but I'm sure he'll say so, this is not a salvageable search. This is not a search with greater disclosure, transparency, or certain rules, which might work with other types of searches, that this can be saved or should be saved. And that's the difference, or in this bill and maybe some other bills that try and work out a framework to take maybe a questionable practice and make it less bad, I would argue. The California gang list being an example of something where they tried to take a questionable practice and make it less bad. We don't take that approach. We simply say this cannot be used. And the fruits of that search can't be used, because what we don't want is state actors and YPD then handing over this data to ATF or the FBI and serving as a predicate in federal court. If the practice is wrong, if the practice is an abridgment of constitutional rights, which I believe it to be, then the fruits of that search should not be used against any individual in any courtroom.
Yeah, I'm so excited about this legislation. So proud to be a part of it. And so this would be the first categorical ban on geofence warrants anywhere in the country. It would be the first ban on law enforcement purchases of geolocation data anywhere in the country. And we already are hearing from state legislators in other parts of the US who are interested in following suit and moving forward with copycat bills that would try to implement this in their jurisdiction. And you know, like Dan said, you know, this isn't about having additional safeguards or having additional record keeping or having things that really are tinkering around the edges. This is a clear categorical ban. It's saying geofence warrants are invasive, they're immoral, they're unconstitutional, and when this law is enacted, they will not exist in New York State. And really, both hitting the geofence warrants, but then also this work purchasing in geolocation data, and then preventing the use of federal partners through that exclusionary rule that Dan was mentioning. So it really will be a comprehensive end to the problem, at least here in New York.
It sounds good. That's my take. Next question. Just kidding. I mean, I obviously need to like give this a read, but it does sound really comprehensive. I'm just like so used to seeing private partners kind of weave their way around things, but this sounds pretty airtight, at least from the way you're describing it.
And I mean, that's the thing. Like, you have to assume when you're trying to regulate the NYPD that they are not going to act in good faith to comply with the law. They never have. And so with this one, it really is intended to be airtight. That being said, we also are going to need legislation at the federal level, because there's always the risk that ICE and working with a federal court can get a federal court order that supersedes anything that we can enact at the state or local level. And so that supremacy clause, it's not something we can get around.
And to Albert's point, one of the exciting things happening is other state legislators and legislatures picking up this idea, because maybe not only would it be good to be able to pass this in New York, but other states as well. And that may be some impetus for Congress to start taking a look at this. If you had 12, 15, 20 states starting to suppress this type of practice and evidence, then maybe Congress would take the step of starting to review the practices by the U.S. attorney's offices and FBI, ATF, ICE, and other branches of federal law enforcement. And I mean, that's the ultimate solution, is not just at the state level, but at the federal level, outlawing this process as well, which I suspect is going to be a longer road and a much more difficult hurdle outside of the courts interceding. But I think movement at the state level can only help federal legislation.
And we have a question from the audience. How do we show support for this legislation?
That's an excellent question. I think talking to legislators, making this, calling legislators, writing letters to my colleagues outside of my district. And really, to me, this is not a partisan issue. So many issues are about your ideology, but I think Republicans or conservatives who truly believe, or actually really believe, in smaller government and non-intrusion government in people's lives, if they are true to that espoused principle, should be supportive as well. So I think there can be bipartisan support for this, but I think calling and writing and emailing your legislator, if you're outside of my district, saying that they should be a sponsor of this, is an effective way, because the way it works in Albany, it's the more a good idea only becomes law when enough of my fellow colleagues believe a good idea is worthy of being passed. So to help Senator Myrie and I, getting more sponsors on the bill is a critical thing, because it shows support, and that helps it get to the floor for passage.
Thank you. That's New York State Assembly Bill 84.
Dan, I just wanted to mention, it looks like your camera may be locked, so your video is coming through vertically. Oh, perfect.
Yeah.
We're about to turn to audience questions. I'm sorry, please.
No, it's fine. Something I just wanted to add, and this isn't really about this is less about what's happening on the legal level, but if folks, an argument that I hear a lot is that people prefer to have their data collected because people love targeted advertising, and then like marketing firms will put out these studies about how much people love targeted advertising. So if you want to prove these private parties wrong, what you can do is just turn off your location services, try paying in cash every once in a while, don't connect to Wi-Fi when you're in the laundromat, just like little things like that. Yeah, your friends will look at you like you're weird. My friends look at me like I'm weird all the time. But at the end of the day, every little bit kind of helps. And you're making it that much harder for these parties to turn your life into a living hell. So it's worth it.
Yeah, but I always get nervous with the self-help because it's so important, right? We all should be doing what we can with the time and the resources we have to try to build more anonymity into the system, to try to use encryption more, to try to but I always worry that it's some of the people who are most at risk from this, who have criminal justice involvement, who are undocumented, who are just trying to, pay the rent and are going from job to job. They don't always have the time or resources to invest on it. And as long as we make privacy something that costs a premium, we're going to build this inequity even further into how this data is weaponized.
Right. It's the worst because like public services, things like food stamps, or like, for example, I used to use an app to like manage my prescription bills because I couldn't afford like psychiatric drugs. Things like that happen on your phone, and things like that do collect data and trade it with private parties in kind of an opaque way. And those are just some examples of services that are targeted towards lower income people. So when you're stuck between like a rock and a hard place, between downloading an app and not being able to afford medication, you're going to go with the app no matter what. And right now, it's just like that's why we do need federal action. It's like no matter what you do, there's going to be people that are going to like end up at the bottom of this barrel.
And one thing that's a personal obsession of mine right now, and I have to bring up, is that there's a whole new layer of location tracking coming in the form of vaccine passports, which we saw rolled out for the first time just this week here in New York, the Excelsior Pass. And this is something where, again, you may now be told, if this actually is scaled up the way some people want, that you don't get to opt out of having a smartphone and having location tracking if you want to go to work or go to school or even go to the supermarket. And so we keep adding even more layers of sort of data capture on top of what is already a deeply dystopian scenario.
Oh, I think that's a very important point by Albert. 10 years in the legislature, you see all these, we do so many study bills and collection of data bills. Study bills are all about collecting more data. We have no idea. Nobody has any idea where this data goes. I'm not saying it will be used for nefarious purposes, but a lot of the legislation we pass in Albany, implicit in this, is the collection of data, information, mostly at times for good intentions. But the real problem comes with what happens with this data. And that's why really my concern, and why it's so important to have a demarcation as we do in this bill, is that this just is not a practice that's acceptable, and not that it can be salvaged in some way. But there is a real concern about data, the expansion of the data with COVID, state-sponsored testing, and giving the vaccine and COVID. And our constitutional system, whether in our state constitution or a federal, is just not girded to deal with these problems. I have read many parts of our state constitution, and goes back to 1890 something, and it's about wagons and buggies, and when the state was agrarian. And I don't think our federal constitution offers much in the way of even imagining this type of technology. Of course, how could they? So this is really an area where we have to be affirmative in legislating, and not suggesting outside of the courts, hopefully interpreting the Fourth Amendment in the way that I think Shoshana, Albert, and I see it, that we have to affirmatively pass legislation. because we cannot rely on constitutional doctrine either at the state level or at the federal level. And waiting for the courts to someday stand up for the Fourth Amendment, how many hundreds, if not thousands of people will have their constitutional rights abridged if we wait for that resolution?
Thank you. I want to remind the audience members, please put questions in the Q&A box. We'll get to those in just a couple of minutes. To speak to your points, what I'm hearing is we can't reasonably ask individuals to protect our location data. We need laws like the bill proposed by Dan, and we need companies to be responsible about collecting the data in the first place and about how they share it. So let's talk about companies and their responsibility to us. And let's talk about Google, since I've heard the company mentioned previously. Google releases a transparency report twice a year detailing how many government requests for user info it gets. But the report doesn't distinguish between standard warrants, like tell us where John Brown was on Friday, and geofence warrants, like tell us everyone who was in City Hall Park and the surrounds on Friday. S.T.O.P and its partners have written Google to say that it needs to report this information. Tell me what kind of responsibility a Google-like entity has for contributing to public oversight of geofence warrants.
Well, I think Google's counsel and I would differ slightly in how we would answer that. So, I mean, part of the problem is Google likes to have it both ways, right? They like to both be viewed as champions of privacy, then like the ones standing up to this, and look at how great our data reporting is. And they really do pride themselves on having this transparency report, which is, you know, one of the first in the industry. But then like, every time advocates push back and say, hey, here's a giant gaping hole in your transparency report where, you know, you've only told us when you were subpoenaed in litigation how many of these geofence warrants you're getting. You're not proactively putting it out there. Oh, and by the way, Google could have told people when this practice started that it was happening, but it didn't. They didn't. They waited until it came out in litigation. And so, you know, personally, I think Google has a moral obligation to dump the data that enables geofence warrants. I think they have a moral obligation to stop keeping information in a way that puts at risk. But at the very minimum, if they actually want to be you know, viewed as transparent about this, they have to actually tell us how often this is happening, and they have to tell us when they're even creepier new forms of warrants that are being served.
Well, I mean, if they really wanted to be transparent, it wouldn't just be Google, it would be Alphabet, which is Google's parent company, which has all these other weird tendrils. Like Link NYC, that whole thing, that wasn't Google. That was an Alphabet company. And the fact that Google, well, the fact that Alphabet desperately tries to kind of cloister all of its entities into all these neat little categories so you don't ask questions about all of the rest of them is something that we let the company get away with. And it's just, it's very frustrating because I know that there's other stuff going on with some of the other subsidiaries, but Google only puts out a transparency report for Google. That's it.
And for people who are not familiar with Link NYC, these are the dystopian monoliths that you may see dotting New York City, that when we gave up our phone booths and, you know, the city decided, okay, let's have a private partner build these horrible Wi-Fi kiosks / you know, charging stations / I don't know what else they do. And, oh, it's free. All we're going to do in exchange is gobble up all the information of people who pass by. Please don't sue me, Sidewalk Labs. That's only a rough estimate of what the trade-off is. But it's this like part of this broader municipal infrastructure scheme that we keep seeing where private companies say, hey, we'll build stuff for free. Isn't this such a great deal? By the way, we want all the data. It's like, you know, and it's just our data being used in exchange for paying for this.
Well, I mean, we saw, oops, sorry.
No, I'll just quick point. I think it's probably sort of having it's trying to have it both ways. Albert said earlier. I mean, it's probably their corporate lawyers saying, we need to do enough so we won't be subject to a class action lawsuit by everyone whose data we've given away and won't be sued. But we also have to comply or will comply with law enforcement. And so it's really about, I think, just in my perspective, doing enough not to get sued and still complying with law enforcement. But there are so many more things they could and should do as a responsible, if they were a responsible corporate actor.
I'm going to cut in with a few questions from our audience. One person asks whether using a VPN can affect the accuracy and success of geolocation data. Does having your location sent to a completely different location or city or country curb geofencing?
I couldn't really speak about that in regards to things like geofence warrants, but I know if somebody's trying to market to you and your ISP is such like a different country entirely, yeah, that kind of does throw them off. So if you really want to mess with private companies, you can set yourself to be in, I don't know, Dubai. That's one way to do it. Your internet might start acting a little funky though.
And one of the issues is there's so many different pools of data that it's hard to know, right? So maybe the geolocation data is coming in part from your mobile phone carrier, but maybe it's partly coming from the app installed on your phone that has permission to access location services as drawing your location from your GPS transceiver rather than actually getting it from the from your IP address. So you could be having all of your internet activity routed through Dubai, but some data brokers would still know you're in the middle of Manhattan.
Yeah, right. So
I'm asking, sorry.
I was just about to say, so like, for example, I have a computer, I have my phone, I have a smart TV right behind me. Unless I'm routing all of those through United Arab Emirates, like someone's gonna know. And when one location broker knows that you're in the US, there's no way to stop them from saying, oh, this Dubai IP address is actually routed to this person in Manhattan and they're the same person and you should know that. So you have to be committed if you're using a VPN.
I chose this question because we have a few questions about, are you sure there's nothing I personally can't do to stop this? Can I turn my phone off? Will that stop tracking? Do we really need legislation? Can I do something to extract myself from geolocation tracking?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to give up modern electronics, it is easy to opt out. I mean, there's still facial recognition, other things to deal with. But yeah, I mean, the problem is that we have created this world where you have to choose. Do you want the advantages of this tech or do you want privacy? And, you know, you can get some privacy benefits on the margins, but when it's coming to location data, it's effectively impossible, right? Unless you're carrying around your device in a Faraday cage and like only taking it, like it basically destroys all of the utility. And the thing that personally is so aggravating is I'm a giant nerd. I'm a gadget geek. I want to be able to use this stuff and not second guess how every tool I buy is being used and weaponized against me.
Yeah, that's it. There are all sorts of ways people can take steps to limit it, but I guess the question is, why should they have to? They shouldn't. Well, all these modern devices are supposed to connect us, make our lives easier. Although, you know, as an elected official for 10 years, I'm happy to sometimes take a break from Twitter and other things as well. But people shouldn't have to choose. They should be able to use these devices to make their lives easier, better, or to engage in communications as they see fit in a modern age, without having to give up their constitutional rights. And I guess part of the question is legislation necessary? I mean, not if the federal courts and the Supreme Court would opine on this issue and set a declarative statement about its unconstitutionality, but I'm not holding my breath for that. Certainly not the Roberts Court. So I think, yes, it is incumbent upon states and Congress to begin the process of really unlayering what it is a search that I just think cannot be salvaged if you line up the Fourth Amendment and the history behind the Fourth Amendment. So I think the answer is yes. Legislation, absent a sweeping Supreme Court decision, is necessary.
I'll ask you then a question about legislation. We've talked about New York State Assembly Bill 84, regulating geofence warrants. We have a question from an audience member who wonders whether there are any legal or regulatory tools that are being put forward to regulate third-party location data vendors, to prevent government agencies from buying this data.
Well, we have the CCPA and the CPRA over in California, but they are progressing at kind of a snail's pace. And this is way too big an issue for one state to kind of deal with. So it's not really working as well as some people have been hoping, at least thus far. Albert, you probably know of other kind of state-by-state regulation that's kind of in the pipe.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are two parts to the life cycle, right? There's one is a lot of what we've been talking about with Dan's bill, which is preventing this information from being sold to law enforcement. On the actually blocking that data from being collected in the first place, we see a few bills that are helpful in this area. Justin Brannan and the city council introduced a bill to prevent a lot of this data from being aggregated in the first place. We certainly have seen some helpful biometric data bills. One thing that concerns me, especially with the Roberts Court, is there's a risk we're going to see a Supreme Court opinion in the next 6 to 12 months that says there's a First Amendment right to scrape a lot of this data. So right now there's a case called HiQ versus LinkedIn, where a firm that was like taking all this information off of LinkedIn said, oh, no, you can't tell me I can't collect that data. It's my First Amendment right to scrape all the data. And what I'm worried we're gonna see is an extension of this really bad case, IMS versus Peril from a few years ago, where essentially under commercial speech doctrine, the Supreme Court said, you as the state can't tell people what data to sell and not sell. And it's really bad. And I think that luckily, one thing we can always regulate as the state is what branches of the state do with that data. So even if we can never constitutionally block the data brokers from getting that giant pool of data, we can block them from selling it to police.
Something I also wanted to point out there, and this isn't really my wheelhouse, but we do know that there is a huge competitive advantage to having this data, and companies like Google are becoming like less and less okay with giving that competitive advantage up. So like, we know that Google is in the middle of like eliminating cookies from its insanely popular browser by 2022, and that's going to like cut off a massive trove of data from companies that could share it with law enforcement. Google's not doing this out of the goodness of their heart, even though they say that they are. They're doing it for a competitive advantage. So because we've established this kind of like cutthroat data economy, you have data that's becoming harder and harder to get your hands on, but that doesn't mean it's going to get harder for companies like Google or Facebook or Amazon. It's just going to get harder for these smaller players. The only thing we can do about the Googles and Facebooks of the world is regulation.
I'm going to ask one more audience member question and then give you a chance to plug your upcoming projects and events. And the question is this: are there positive uses for geolocation data in the public sector, and what are they? And I'll add to this, can we allow these positive uses while blocking inappropriate uses of geolocation data by the government?
Yeah, sorry, Dan, you go first.
No, I'm not aware. Do you think they're positive uses, Albert?
Yeah, so I think part of what's so problematic here is I think there are a lot of use cases that would be fantastic if not for the threat of police misuse. So I'll give you a big one, congestion pricing, right? If we want to have a congestion pricing system for New York City, we're going to have to find a way to actually figure out who is driving into and out of Lower Manhattan, and to reliably charge them for the amount of time they spend there. And so that's going to require some form of geolocation data. And that's something where, I as someone who has, as long as I've lived in New York City, which is a very long time, always railed against driving in the city, that's something I'm very excited about if we do it in a privacy protective way, but not otherwise. And so I do think there are some examples like that where if you have non-law enforcement entities getting this information for a very specific purpose with the right safeguards, it's fantastic. But if like the Department of Transportation were to get that today, it would be a nightmare, because the first thing that NYPD would do is just try to use that as a giant tracking tool for every car in the city.
Yeah.
No, and it's awful because like Uber has an entire subsidiary that works with city planners to make cities more efficient and easier to get around. Like that is an objective good. But then you have the police going to Uber and asking for the same data that they use. And it's just like, can you have one without the other? It's
unfortunately, the history of the NYPD suggests not. And I'll give you one example. After the Floyd case came down, the federal court ruled that stop and frisk was unconstitutional as applied in New York City based upon the numbers from the Bloomberg administration. The response by the NYPD under Commissioner Kelly was this essentially Operation Crew Cut, which was I'll bore the listeners with all the details, but it was essentially we're going to use technology to replicate what we can't do with a physical stop anymore. Which you would think if the federal courts have ruled a practice unconstitutional, that you wouldn't try and replicate the results in some other way. But that's exactly what the NYPD did. And that concept of Operation Crew Cut was the initiation of all this expansive technology, although it may have been used already by the NYPD, but they doubled and tripled down on their use of technology as a means of basically the non-physical stop of Black and brown New Yorkers and poor New Yorkers after that practice was ruled unconstitutional. So if you look at the history of the NYPD, it is fair and reasonable to look at them with a jaundiced eye of whether they can be trusted to not misuse technology as a means for expansive law enforcement practices.
Thank you. It's fascinating. It's been a fascinating conversation. We're just about out of time. I'd like to thank our panelists, New York State Assembly Member Dan Quart, Gizmodo reporter Shoshana Wodinsky, and S.T.O.P Executive Director and Founder Albert Cahn. In closing, take 60 seconds to tell us about your upcoming work or about upcoming events that we shouldn't miss.
All right, I'm happy to go first. So, well, first of all, Eleni, thank you so much for moderating the event. Thank you, Shoshana and Dan, for joining us. Thank you for everyone who's tuning in, both in Zoom and on all of the various creepy social media platforms that we're forced to use to connect with everyone. One thing I would love to shamelessly plug is that S.T.O.P is about to turn 2 years old. And to mark the anniversary, we're going to have a online birthday party. I'm posting the link into the chat here in the Zoom. We'll have it on social media as well. And would really love if folks who support the work we're doing around Geofence Warrants and other forms of privacy would be able to join us for the celebration. So that's my log rolling.
I'll go. Thanks for having me here. This is always fascinating, if not a frustrating thing to talk about, as I'm sure we can all agree. Read Gizmodo.com. We do good reporting and we work hard at it. And also go to S.T.O.P's thing, because S.T.O.P is a fantastic organization and it's great that they're all of 2 years old.
And I want to thank my fellow panelists, Shoshana and my good friend Albert and Eleni for moderating this. I guess I'll give one shameless plug. It's my 10th year in the legislature. I'm also a candidate for Manhattan District Attorney this year. So I hope those who are listening, if you like what you've heard, consider supporting me in that race. But as importantly, this is an issue or issues on technology and privacy that I've tried to talk about and am talking about in this race for district attorney. Criminal justice reform and reforming our system takes many forms, but it also takes the form of stopping practices using technology as an abridgment of constitutional rights. Law enforcement and making cases and prosecuting individuals should never take the form of abridging their constitutional rights. And this is a practice that I believe goes too far in that delicate balance. And there's no balance needed here is all. So I've said my piece. I really appreciate it. And to learn more about my campaign, please go to my website. And I thank you all for tuning in today.
Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of New York City Open Data Week and stop spying in New York.